We reduce the conversation about sexuality to sex, and then we want to argue about, okay, is it supposed to only happen within marriage, when we don't even really understand our sexuality. And so there again, we reduce it to the act and go, well, that act happened outside of marriage. Why though? What's broken in our identity, our longing to know God and know intimacy, true intimacy, where there's no fear, we could actually be naked and unashamed. But we have been there again trained to say it's the act, and that's like, I'll often say, Deb, like God's not sitting up in heaven on a throne and he's just freaking pissed off because your neighbor's having sex with his girlfriend. No, he cares about it in this, that you don't understand his heart for you, and you don't understand who he's made you in his image to be, and the depth of relationship he longs for you to have. And so it breaks his heart that you're trying to fit everything else in instead. That's what he's concerned with, not the act. It's the heart behind it.
Christians have this tendency to look at the broader world as all these people, kind of pursuing sex and sexuality and, trying to, have all these needs met. And we look at it in a negative. And I say from a missional perspective, just, think about what if in humanity's explicit search of sex is an implicit search for God.
Welcome to the Everyday Disciple podcast, where you'll learn how to live with greater intentionality and an integrated faith that naturally fits into every area of life. In other words, discipleship as a lifestyle. This is the stuff your parents, pastors, and seminary professors probably forgot to tell you. And now, here's your host, Caesar Kalinowski.
Hey, glad you've joined us again for this episode. I'm just going to dive right in and invite you to join us over on the Facebook group. We are over there. I'm in there every day. It's an easy way to talk, stay connected, hear about training that's coming up, new episodes. And also, I want to invite you to join us in the Facebook group, or if you already are, join me in there with some ideas for things you'd like us to talk about on upcoming episodes of the Everyday Disciple podcast. Getting ready to record a whole new batch of episodes, and I would love to speak to things that you want to hear about, things connected to the gospel speaking into everyday life and everyday discipleship. So if you want to do that, you can search that up on Facebook real easy for the Everyday Disciple podcast, or just go to everydaydisciple.com/Facebook, and that'll take you right there. And for those of you who have joined, there's a real easy little button to invite others to join. So within your friends and all that in Facebook, I would love it if you'd do that. Many of our really committed listeners are consistently inviting friends to the Facebook group as well to make sure they're getting those reminders of the new episodes that drop every single Monday morning. So I invite you to do that. Join us in the Facebook group. I hope you will. And as always, if you'd like to explore getting some help setting up a full framework for discipleship and mission as a lifestyle, I'd love to connect with you and see if we can help. You can set up a short Zoom call by going to everydaydisciple.com/discovery. That's everydaydisciple.com/discovery. And we can just chat. I can get to know you a little bit, see what your context is, maybe what some of your challenges are, and see if we could help you out with that. I would love it. Now, today, I am super pleased to be able to share this repeat broadcast of a conversation that Heath and I had a few years back now, hard to believe, had with my good pal, author, rock star, sister to many, Debra Hirsch. Deb is going to help us reframe our understanding of our sexuality in light of the gospel. Yeah, not too many people talking about that. Listening to this interview today reminded me of just how powerful her ideas and clarity around our sexuality and relationship with God is. Deb Hirsch is a speaker. She's a church leader and obviously a writer and author. She's led churches both in Australia, where she's from, and Los Angeles. And along with her husband, Alan Hirsch, who you've probably read his books as well and heard him here on the Everyday Disciple podcast, she is one of the founders of Forge Mission Training Network. Awesome stuff they've done. Now, her new book, Redeeming Sex, reflects something of her own journey and attempts to bring new conversations around sexuality into the context of the church. Deb has been involved in social work, community development, and as a trained counselor has worked in the field of sexuality for 25 plus, maybe 30 years now. I want you to take a listen. Hey, Heath, good to be here and pretty excited to have our sister Deb with us. Deb, I have been in love, well, with you and Al forever, but this book has just been so, I know it's blessed so many people, but it's not just the book, it's really your heart and it's your posture towards sexuality and identity and just the conversation that's so often we literally, like our parents and teachers and pastors did not teach us well on. So I'm really excited about that.
Deb, can I start us off?
Sure. Yes.
Your book, Redeeming Sex, came out a couple years ago and was super transformative to many people. I was even reading, as I was doing some research for the show, just blogs and people quoting it. Massive impact for a lot of people. Would you mind sharing a bit of your background on why this topic is something that you're so passionate about? Like, why did you write this particular book?
Well, that is a good question. And this is going to sound like the very simple kind of answer that everybody gives, but I really did feel a calling to write it. Number of years ago, or many years ago, back in Australia, I would do a teaching series at some of the seminaries there about identity and relationships. And a number of my students back then, constantly saying to me, you need to put this into a book. And I always had a sense, yes, I would write a book. And to be honest, I had a couple of people in different countries even who didn't really know much about me and felt that, had a word for me and said that I was going to write a book. So it's been a brewing for a long, long time.
So obviously it's been on your heart and you've been speaking about it. And that's why people have been, for years have been asking you to write on it. I totally see that. Why was it on your heart to even begin to speak about it, given all the various topics that you could have spoken to and, that people need to hear about? Why that particular topic were you being called to and kind of gripped by it?
Sure. Well, partly it's my own part of my own personal journey. When I found Jesus, or I should say when Jesus found me, I was living and identifying as a gay woman, as were a number of my friends, and we all had spiritual encounters and ended up, some months down the track coming into the community of faith in terms of finding a church home, and just realized how little resources were in the church for not just understanding the gay community per se, but just sexuality in general. And I was we were all quite taken back actually of the little understanding and just even conversations around human sexuality.
It seems that I know the church I grew up in too, any aspect of sexuality or sex or identity, it was tiptoed around. It was not really taught, discussed. It wasn't understood the depth of who we are and humanity and how much that's a part of who we are. It was almost just not even on the shelf.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly right. That's what was my experience as well. And it was quite concerning, to be honest. And particularly as when I met Al and we got married and went into full-time ministry, a lot of our early ministry experience and some of the stuff that we did really was around a lot of people that were, what we might call, damaged in areas of their sexuality or felt a deep sense of brokenness about their sexuality. And we worked a lot with male and female prostitutes with our first church plant, and it was a lot of there weren't a lot of resources to help people like that, and so we were from the very beginning really very immersed in the whole field of sexuality, and I went on to be trained as a counselor as well, and did a lot of counseling in that area. So it was something particularly close to my heart, and in our church, again, we were dealing with lots of sexuality and lots of sexual problems and sexual brokenness. It came out of that, really.
It seems easy to say, oh, well, we're looking at a person who has, maybe identifying LGBT or, gender confusion there or a prostitute or something. It's easy for us to say, oh, see, there's a problem with their sexuality. But I'm sitting here thinking like, I can remember back to when I was young and a boy and a man and then becoming a dad and all. Isn't it true that probably many or most all of us have aspects of our sexuality and our identity kind of broken?
Oh, very, very much so. And I think one of the things over the years that I have come to realize is that particularly, and I guess this is more relevant too for today, in a sense, is, I've come to look at the whole, say, the LGBT conversation as a micro conversation. And I think we get stuck in that conversation because, the church is a bit freaking out and trying to how do we respond to this and all of that. And I say to people, we can't just focus on the micro conversation. We need to put it into the context of the macro conversation, because if we just focus there, we are missing the whole big picture. And the whole big picture is that we are all sexual, profoundly sexual, each and every one of us. And we are all profoundly broken in our sexuality. And I find it's too easy for the church to point to the sexual minorities and declare them broken, which frankly has become a very offensive word to them. And I can completely understand that. So it's important for us to recognize if we're going to say sexuality is broken in certain individuals, we're going to say it's broken in all of us, because sin and brokenness has impacted every aspect of our humanity. Yeah, so it's very important for us to get the macro picture on this, because it actually includes all of us in the conversation. It's not just about, we point the finger, those people over there. It's actually about all of us.
We'll never get there until we go to the macro, like you said.
No, that's exactly right.
So, Deb, a little bit of my story. I come from maybe the flip side of the coin, being raised in the church. And it is interesting, even as you're talking, and the church not being willing to engage in these conversations. Maybe it's fear, or maybe it's trying to play it safe, because it's never addressed. Sex is viewed completely distorted, even when they're trying to approach it from a healthy standpoint. So me and my wife, 12 years into marriage, both of us have only been with each other in our marriage, but because we were both raised in the church and sex wasn't talked about, we still 12 years later feel like, are we allowed? Is this okay? Is this, it's scarred every aspect. And one of the interviews I watched, you had mentioned the importance of broadening our definition of sexuality much further than we currently do. How would you unpack the concept of sexuality, and what do you really mean by this?
Yeah. Yes. Well, let me just say, as you were talking about your experience there, I thought of a quote that I have in my book that if I can just read it, I think it's quite a funny quote, but it sums up so much. And this is by Butch Hancock, and he's talking about life in Lubbock, Texas. And he says, "Life in Lubbock, Texas taught me two things. One is that God loves you and you're going to burn in hell. The other is that sex is the most awful, filthy thing on earth, and you should save it for someone you love."
Oh my gosh. Okay, Deb, make sure you email that to me. And I think we'll have to add that to the big three,
It's
just
pretty
because
amazing.
people are going to want to have that. So
Yes.
yeah, later on when we get to the big three, I'm going to add that. So yeah, no, I'm serious. Like, send me that. That's amazing.
Okay, I will do that.
How would you encourage us to, press those limits and unpack that concept of sexuality?
Well, I think what we have to do is, I kind of say it like this: we have to rescue human sexuality from being predominantly remaining in the realm of genital sexuality. Because when our scripting is such that when we think of sexuality, we narrow it, and we reduce everything about sexuality down to what we do with our bits and bobs, which is just a funny way of
Your bits and bobs.
our bits and bobs.
Yeah, I think I'd say we're reducing it down to do equals be again. It's all about the act. It's all about the bits.
Well, there you go. That's very right, Caesar. So I think we've got to rescue it from there. That it certainly is part of our sexuality. Obviously, I mean, I say to people, none of us would be alive today if somebody didn't have sex. So clearly, it's a very strong link towards life itself. But it's in terms of the way we respond as sexual beings, it's much, much more. If we look at sexuality more as our relational side of who we are as humans, that includes all of our relationships, not just those that might be motivated genitally speaking.
And Deb, isn't there? And there's a deep. I know I've heard you talk about this. There's a deep connection between our sexuality and the depth of relationship that God has for us, and that might freak our listeners out right away. Unless we broaden our understanding of our sexuality, how do we actually embrace the depth of relationship that God actually has for all of us?
Yeah. And I think that's exactly right, Cesar. And I think you're tapping into something here that is, an increasing concern for me too, is because I think our sexuality is, we miss a lot of the connections between our sexuality and our spirituality. But our spirituality in the broadest, biggest sense of the term is our longing to know and be known by, what I call the capital O other beyond us, that we as believers name, and as in Jesus, we name God, who we come to know in and through Jesus. And I think our longing for God, that is mirrored in a sense in our longing for one another. And I think that, in the church, we limit a lot of our depth or intensity of feeling and emotion to the marriage relationship, which kind of, is problematic on multiple levels. Not the least that, our singles are not taught to feel deep or to feel passionate about others, because that's reserved just for marriage. And I say, no, God has created us as people to have a depth of longing and a depth of passion. We feel deeply as people. And I think Christians don't feel deeply enough. Actually, I think we're not passionate enough for one another. And I think passion, again, goes beyond just the genital connection.
And talk about, again, the micro conversation. We have so often, and myself as, I'll put myself on that list, we reduce the conversation about sexuality to sex. And then we want to argue about, okay, is it supposed to only happen within marriage, when we don't even really understand our sexuality? And so there again, we reduce it to the act and go, well, that act happened outside of marriage. Well, why though? Like what's broken in our identity and our longing to know God and know true intimacy where there's no fear. We could actually be naked and unashamed. But we have been there again trained to say it's the act, and that's like, I'll often say, Deb, like God's not sitting up in heaven on a throne and he's just freaking pissed off because your neighbor's having sex with his girlfriend. You know what I mean? It's like, no, he cares about it in this, that you don't understand his heart for you, and you don't understand who he's made you in his image to be and the depth of relationship he longs for you to have. And so it breaks his heart that you're trying to fit everything else in instead. That's what he's concerned with, not the act. It's the heart behind it. And
imagine if we thought of, we Christians have this tendency to look at the broader world as all these people, kind of pursuing sex and sexuality and, trying to, have all these needs met. And we look at it, in a negative. And I say from a missional perspective, just, think about what if in humanity's explicit search of sex is an implicit search for God.
Oh, man.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Beautiful.
In the Chesterton, G.K. Chesterton suggested that a man knocking on the door of a brothel was actually looking for God. So, what is going on there? And I do think our human longing for one another is a reflection, of our greater longing for God. So imagine missionary, if we started thinking of it like that, we would be less likely to judge people and more likely to see the God traces in their lives and the God longings in their lives.
Deb, I think what you're saying, you've said like 3 or 4 things that are really, really powerful in our search.
Deb's dropping bombs today.
Yeah, I can't keep up. One of the things that you had mentioned was, especially in the church, you've called the church to develop more of a robust sort of theology of sexuality, and maybe even saying that we need to create a new language or inject new meaning into some of the concepts we have. What does this look like and sound like? Do you have any examples of this? And is this going to freak people out?
Well, the church already gets freaked out by sexuality. So I don't, maybe I freak them out a little bit more with the way that I communicate about it. But honestly, I think we need a good shake-up. So I think the first way is that we've just got to talk normal about this stuff. Still we don't have a language, or we don't know how to talk about it, number one, because we've still got this weird cloud of taboo that hangs over all things sexual. And so we still kind of talk about sexuality like this,
Or in very, very rigid, legalistic ways, there again, sort of reducing sexuality to the act, not the person.
Yes, and like this naughty thing, that's kind of done behind closed doors and with lights off. It's just, again, you're exactly right. We reduce it to that, and it's all this kind of negative stuff. So I think we've got to be able to talk about it more freely, more openly. And I think this is where I'm seeing such a great gap between the generations at the moment. When I'm talking with younger people, they say it as it is. They just say it as it is. And yet when you get them inside the church context, among one another, they might still say it as it is, but it's not, they don't talk about it like they would with me, like they would with other people in the church, or with, certainly with their parents. And so I think there's a gap going on there. We've got to play a little bit of catch up there.
Well, there's also there's a cultural freak out. Like, I'm sure you've had this happen, Deb. having been, full-time pastor, Heath's a pastor, it's like, even people who are not inside the church, those who may not count themselves Christians, follow Christ, they'll say things connected to sex or their sexuality and then apologize for it.
Yes. Yeah.
Be like, oh man, me and my girlfriend last night were really oh, sorry, pastor, I forgot. It's like,
Yeah, we don't use those words.
we don't use those. We don't talk about sex. Can I say penis? Is that okay? Pastor, father, or something. It's like, yeah, well, you have one. I have one. I guess we can talk. So.
Yeah, it's very true.
Well, how does how does the church get, a new language when we don't have it yet? It's kind of like saying, well, we suck at English, so let's just make up a new, how do we help? How do we help? I think I love what you're saying. Like we have to start talking about it. We have to get it out and open and not just reduce it all the time to the act alone and would you say bobbles and bits and bobbles?
Bits and bobs.
Bobs,
Bobs,
bits
yeah.
and bobs. Okay.
Bob. Yeah. Well, again, we've got to normalize it. I think, Caesar, it's got to be normalized. This is not. This is part of who we are. We have longings. We have desires. And again, it's not just limited to the genital. I often say to people, I've been in love with more people than I've wanted to have sex with. So we've got to start naming some of that. We do get drawn to certain individuals, and it doesn't have to have anything to do with sex, but what does it mean to be able to emotionally bond with others? And again, this taps into all of the stuff in the church around, boundaries between, the two different sexes. And again, I mean, I don't have the time to go into it, but even just the two different sexes, we've got to really catch up a lot with what's going on in broader culture regarding gender and all of that as well.
Oh, let's have you back and let's talk about that, huh? Let's talk about gender.
That's a big conversation right there. I often say to people in the context of the church, that's one conversation we don't really get is the gender conversation, because we're still fighting over what roles men and women should have, where broader society is completely redefining what it is to be male and female. So.
It's something that even as you're talking, I'm convicted of how it's sort of what you're saying. Like, we tend to be late to the game in any conversation. The church tends to, like, as a whole, disregard the conversation until it's the forefront of cultural engagement, and then we come across as angry and frustrated because we haven't thought through it. We've seen it with the abortion issue. We've seen it in gay rights issue. Like, the church stays really quiet, and then all of a sudden
freaks out.
We lose our minds because we're 30 years behind because we haven't paid attention to or welcome. I feel like the church needs to be leading those conversations. Wouldn't you say so?
Oh, absolutely. We should be leading these conversations on every level. God was the one that came up with the idea of male and female. God was the idea who came, the one that came up with the orgasm, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
Thanks for inventing that, God. Super thankful for that.
But it does highlight something. I'll never forget years ago when Alan did a wedding, and he was, you know what a wedding's like. It's a very formal situation. They're up the front of the church, and I tune in and out to my husband sometimes. It's just the way it is, isn't it?
What?
But I tuned in.
I'm going to ask Tina a question now.
No, yes. But I tuned into him when he was actually saying, wouldn't you like to meet the God who created the orgasm? And it was one of those moments where I clutched my pearls and thought, oh my gosh, did he just say that? We're at a wedding. And of course, he thought it was perfectly normal. It's a wedding. Things are going to happen that night. But the fascinating thing for us was, there were some Christians there that were offended that he used the word God and orgasm in the same sentence. And yet all the non-Christians were lined up afterwards wanting to talk to him about the God who created the orgasm.
Yeah.
And, again, we get funny about using those words, but again, this is our God's idea.
You know what it reminds me of? Like, I'm just sitting here listening, Deb, and you talk about it needs to be out in the open. It needs to be more normalized. Of course, God created it. He creates it all good. It's for our pleasure and His glory. And I remember when we were raising our kids, we didn't do everything right, certainly as parents. But one of the things that we kind of early on talked about, Tina and I, was that we're going to normalize that conversation. Like, it's not going to be like the first time we talk about, our private bits, our genitals is going to be like when they're about 12. And then it's like, nope, we're going to talk about it. And if anything is a problem, they have questions, anybody's messing with them, their identity is connected to it in some like shame or weird way. We're just going to normalize the conversation, both from an identity standpoint, a physical standpoint, a pleasure standpoint. Everybody has genitals standpoint, and I think it really was exactly what was needed, and I think it's kind of like, I mean, we often say that discipleship and really leading church is kind of a reparenting of the culture, so to speak. So
Yeah.
that's
Yep.
kind of how I'm connecting it.
Yep. No, that's very true. And again, today, parents ask me all the time, when should we start talking about it? And I say to them, when they start asking. I mean, it's the reality is the world is educating very, very early, and we're behind on that. So
Yeah.
I think you're right, Caesar. We've got to be way more open and normalize it.
So parents, don't have the talk with your kids. Just talk with your kids.
Yes, that's
right?
right. That's exactly right.
So Deb, as we kind of start to move towards wrapping things up, let me ask you a question. And you're such a sweetheart, but I want you to be really super honest here, because if we need a bit of a kick in the rear, that let's go for it. But what's one thing that the church really needs to hear regarding sexuality right today? And what's one thing maybe the church thinks they understand, but they really don't? Maybe that's the same thing. I don't know.
Well, I think gender is definitely that. Our response to broader culture is woefully inadequate. Let me say it that way. So that's one. But you know what? The other one I think that is really important too, and this goes back to the earlier question about how we can bring in, new meanings or new concepts or new meanings to old worn concepts. I think the whole issue or the whole conversation around celibacy is really, really important. Because at the moment, those that are walking the path of celibacy or attempting to, or, our singles, both straight and gay, really feel like they're locked in a lifelong, prison sentence in solitary confinement. There's a whole lot of negativity around that it's kind of like a burden that they have to carry. And yet there were different times in church history where I think celibacy was seen as the highest spiritual ideal. And it was like, oh, if you have to, get married in a sense. And I think
That's right. Paul said that, didn't he? Yeah.
and so I think today we need to create a much more healthy, positive conversation around celibacy, and also what it means. If we're talking about people being single, what does it mean to be single within the Church of God? And I think
And still be a sexual being.
and still be a sexual being. And again, that's where we need to expand our understanding of sexuality, because it is not just about having sex. It's about having relationships that are deep and that are soul filling, for us on multiple levels. And I think when we begin to have more positive conversations around celibacy, we get to bring Jesus into the conversation, who was a celibate man whose call was not to be married. So therefore, genital sexual expression in that sense wasn't, in a sense, available for Jesus because of his distinct call. So he needed to kind of really engage the whole world of his social sexuality in order to sustain his full humanity. And I think he becomes then a very viable model for those that are walking the path of celibacy. But it also is a conversation that impacts all of us, because in God's church, I don't believe there should be any such thing as a single person. We ought to belong to one another. And so it raises questions around redefining family. What does it mean to belong to one another? What was Jesus talking about when he redefined family?
And clearly it says that Jesus was fully God and fully human. It wasn't like, well, mostly human.
Yes.
But he was celibate, so he kind of missed out on a big part of that. So it's like, no.
Well, that's right. And I laugh because in our broader culture at the moment, celibacy is seen as suspicious at best. It's like you're either suppressed or you're repressing something or you got psychological hang-ups. And I think, no, I don't think people would be brave enough to say that of Jesus. Here he was, a fully human man, fully whole and healthy.
Just to make sure it's been said a couple times, because wow, Deb, we could just keep talking and talking. I want to make sure people do go and get online, go to the store, whatever, get your book, Redeeming Sex. And I love the subtitle, Naked Conversations About Sexuality and Spirituality. Boy, if that doesn't make you want to read it. So make sure you get that. Keith, where are we going?
Yeah. So Deb, as we close, thanks for being a guest with us. We hope you come back. It sounds like this is just starting to crack open the chest of where we could have conversations about gender and sex and the LGBT community. So I think we have a lot more in the future. But as far as this current conversation that we've had, we like to close each podcast with like 3 things that we can give away to our friends based off the discussion that we just had. So this could be advice or action steps or something that they get to do right now. And we call those the big 3.
Yep, and I love that Deb is giving us our big 3 for this episode. And you can get a free downloadable PDF of this week's big 3 by going to everydaydisciple.com/big3, BIG3.
Deb, what would be your big 3 for this week?
Well, I think read the whole conversation. That's, particularly again as believers, we have a bit of an inconsistency or an imbalance in the church as what we call sin. I think for most of us and most communities of faith, that when we're talking about sexual sin, they're the ones that seem to be the sins that are on the top of our totem pole, if you like, the more important ones. So I like to say to people, first and foremost, why are they up on the top of the totem pole? Why do sexual sinners always feel like the ones that, are never forgiven, or they've always got, they wear the kind of, the shame, I guess, on them. So just be a bit more consistent with what we're calling sin.
God doesn't rank sin, right? God doesn't rank sin.
God does not rank sin. So, be careful with that. I think that's really important. Get perspective there and start paying attention. If you're going to call one sin out, make sure, you're focusing on other things as well. Look to Jesus as your model there. What were the things that were important to him?
I've often said, like, we will jump on that and marginalize people and just really go after that, and then leave the church service and go to the all-you-can-eat buffet. And, we know that like 2/3 of America is overweight or obese. And it's like, but no one would ever say anything about it. It's like what? Okay. So, that's a great first of the big 3. What's your second big takeaway for us, Deb?
Well, I think most of us draw our sexual ethics in a sense, well, when we're looking at the New Testament anyway, from Paul. And if you read Paul, he says some pretty strong things. There's no denying that. And they're important things. But I say to people, when you read Paul and you're developing your sexual ethics, don't read Paul without taking on the posture of Jesus. And I think we can say that for all things, obviously. But I think Jesus, when, there's a few encounters there that he has with people that we might call sexually broken. The woman caught in adultery is the classic one of my favorite stories. Look at his posture there. There's something so deeply incredible and accepting of Jesus. And I think what he shows us is that acceptance must precede repentance. In the woman caught in adultery, he says to her, after he levels everybody, which is just beautiful, he then says to her, your accusers have gone, or she tells him her accusers have gone, and he says, neither do I condemn you. There's words of deep acceptance. It's the open arms of Jesus, first and foremost, before he says, now go live your life of sin. And I think in the church, we've reversed that order. We kind of communicate to people, go live your life of sin, then we will accept you. With Jesus, it's the other way, because Romans tells us that it's God's kindness that leads us to repentance. So model the posture of Jesus. Don't miss. Acceptance precedes repentance. Wow. Yeah. Okay, number 3. That's so good, Deb. Wow. Well, I think for number 3, really just begin to bring grace back into human sexuality. I think our sexuality, of all of who we are, our sexuality has been the least area that we have graced, particularly as a church. So I just say to people, do you know what? When we mess up sexually, or when we're broken in areas of our sexuality, our sexuality is our most vulnerable part of who we are, isn't it? It's where we feel our pain. It's where our longings are felt. It's our desires for intimacy on genital and non-genital ways. And I think that we all feel a sense, especially when we do sin and when we are broken, it's very easy to have a whole lot of shame that begins to surround us. And I think shame is not good for the human soul. It's not good at all. And I think we must bring grace back into a disgraced area of our lives. And I think in doing that, I think, it'll be a different church. Wow. There's no shame in the gospel, and there's no should, and there's no supposed to. I mean, in Christ we get to, or we need not. And it's beautiful, Deb. Thanks for that reminder. Wow.
Yeah. And if you're liking the podcast, be sure to head over to iTunes and you could subscribe to it. You could rate the show, write up a review. That helps us be able to get these conversations out to people that might not normally hear it. Deb's book, Redeeming Sex, is available on Amazon. Go get the book.
Get the book.
A great read.
Again, Deb, thanks so much, sister.
Thanks, guys. Lovely to talk with you both.
Well, I told you, she is so smart and gentle and articulate. I really love this conversation. And I really love the hard work and blessing that Deb and Alan both continue to be to the church. I'm humbled to call them both really good friends of mine. Well, that's it for today. I hope that this has given you plenty to think about, and I hope you'll share this episode with others in your life and in church. And please join us again next week. We will continue to look at how the good news of the gospel speaks into and reshapes everything about everything. All right? I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks for joining us today. For more information on this show and to get loads of free discipleship resources, visit everydaydisciple.com. And remember, you really can live with the spiritual freedom and relational peace that Jesus promised every day.